Happy birthday, kid. Checks stop coming, so you stop staying. The front door of the beige suburban split level didn't just close. It slammed with the finality of a prison gate. The sound cracked through the freezing February air, louder than the wind howling down the cul-de-sac. Mia stood on the welcome mat, staring at the wood grain. She was 16 years old today. Her present was an eviction. The Millers hadn't even let her pack properly. At her feet lay a battered Jansport backpack with a busted zipper, spilled halfway onto the frost-covered concrete. Inside was everything she owned in the world. 2 flannel shirts, a pair of worn-out Converse, a stolen loaf of Wonder Bread, and a lighter she'd found in the gutter 3 months ago. She didn't knock. She didn't cry. You don't cry when you're a ward of the state. You learn to calculate odds. And the odds said, if she stayed on this porch, the neighbors would call the cops, and she'd be hauled off to a group home that smelled like bleach and despair. Mia shoved her arms into her thin denim jacket, the fabric stiff with cold. She grabbed the backpack and turned her back on the only roof she'd had for 2 years. Fine, she whispered, her breath blooming in a white cloud. I didn't like the wallpaper anyway. She had $4.35 in her pocket and a destination that might not even exist. The Greyhound bus ride took 6 hours, dragging her out of the city limits, past the sprawling strip malls, and deep into the rural veins of the state. By the time the driver shouted, "Cedar Valley, last stop," the sun had already bled out behind the mountains, leaving the world in a bruised purple twilight. Mia stepped off the bus. The cold here was different. It wasn't the wet, slushy cold of the city. It was a dry, sharp razor that sliced right through her jeans. According to the crumpled letter tucked inside her mom's old leather-bound journal, the one thing she'd managed to hide from the Millers, the farm was 3 miles up the old logging road. 3 miles in a blizzard. She started walking. The snow crunched under her boots like breaking bones. The wind screamed through the pines, whipping her hair across her face, blinding her. Her fingers, curled deep in her pockets, were already going numb. She focused on putting one foot in front of the other. Left. Right. Breathe. Don't stop. If you stop, you sleep. If you sleep, you die. By the time the silhouette of the house emerged from the whiteout, Mia couldn't feel her toes. It wasn't a house, it was a carcass. The structure loomed against the darkening sky. A 2-story farmhouse that looked like it had been punched in the gut by a giant. The roof sagged dangerously in the middle. The windows were boarded up or shattered, looking like hollowed-out eyes. The porch railing hung by a single rusty nail, swinging rhythmically in the gale. Creak, bang, creak, bang. Sanctuary, she muttered, reading the word from her mother's letter. Right. It looks like a murder scene, but it was shelter. She stumbled up the steps, the wood groaning under her weight. She dropped to her knees, digging frantically under a large, turtle-shaped river rock near the foundation. Her frozen fingers scrabbled in the dirt. Clink, metal. She pulled out a heavy iron skeleton key. It was cold enough to burn her skin. She jammed it into the lock. It wouldn't turn. Come on, she gritted out, panic rising in her throat like bile. Please. She used both hands, putting her entire body weight into the twist. With a screech of protesting metal, the bolt gave way. The door drifted open. The air inside was stale, smelling of dead mice, sawdust, and a century of silence. But it was out of the wind. Mia kicked the door shut behind her and collapsed onto the floorboards. It was pitch black. The darkness felt heavy, pressing against her eyelids. She needed heat. Now. She crawled toward where she assumed the living room was, feeling her way along the peeling wallpaper until her hand hit the cold stone of a hearth, a fireplace. She ripped pages out of an old telephone book she found on the floor and shoved them into the grate along with some splintered pieces of a broken chair leg. She pulled out the lighter. It was a cheap, translucent plastic bic. She could see the fluid level. It was almost empty, just a few drops sloshing at the bottom. Flick, sparks, no flame. Mia's heart hammered against her ribs. The cold was settling into her marrow now, making her shiver violently. Flick, nothing. Don't do this, she begged the plastic object. Don't you dare. She shook it. She warmed it between her frozen palms, blowing hot air onto the metal guard. She closed her eyes, visualizing the flame. Flick, a tiny tongue of blue fire sputtered to life. Mia gasped, protecting the fragile flame with her cupped hand like it was a newborn bird. She lowered it to the paper. The edge of the page curled, blackened, and then, miraculously, caught. Yellow light flooded the room, chasing back the shadows. Mia sat back on her heels, watching the fire eat the dry paper and lick at the wood. She pulled the loaf of squashed bread from her bag, tearing off a heel with her teeth. It tasted like cardboard, but it was food. She was 16. She was homeless. She was alone in a rotting house in the middle of nowhere. But as the fire crackled, casting long, dancing shadows against the walls, Mia Marlo realized one thing. She was still alive, and the long night had just begun. The fire was a liar. From where Mia sat, huddled on the hearth, with her knees pulled to her chest, the small flames promised warmth. But the heat died before it reached the tips of her Converse. The chimney, cold and clogged with years of soot, wasn't drawing properly yet. Instead of sucking the smoke up, it pushed a thin, acrid haze back into the room, stinging her eyes. But it was light, and right now, light was the only currency Mia had left. She looked around the room properly for the first time. If the exterior of the farmhouse was a skeleton, the interior was its ghost. The beam of the firelight danced across walls clad in peeling floral wallpaper that hung in strips like shedding skin. Shadows stretched and twisted in the corners, playing tricks on her exhaustion-addled brain. The silence was the heavy, suffocating kind you only find in the deep American backcountry. No sirens, no distant highway hum, no neighbor's TV. Just the wind battering the siding, sounding like 1,000 fingernails scratching to get in. Okay, Mia whispered. Her voice sounded too loud, cracking the silence. Inventory. Real inventory. She stood up, her legs stiff. She needed to know what she was dealing with before the adrenaline crashed and the hypothermia set in. She grabbed a heavy piece of firewood, a broken banister spindle she'd found, and held it like a baseball bat. She moved toward the kitchen. The linoleum floor was cracked, curling up at the edges to reveal the subfloor beneath. A calendar hung on the wall, featuring a faded picture of a golden retriever in a field of daisies. The date read, November 1998. Mia exhaled, a plume of white vapor escaping her lips. No one had lived here for 28 years. She tried the faucet at the farmhouse sink. The handle was rusted stuck. She used her sleeve for grip and wrenched it. Screech. Nothing. Not even a drip. The pipes weren't just dry, they were likely frozen solid or burst decades ago. Perfect, she muttered. Just perfect. Thirst hit her then, sudden and sharp. A dry ache at the back of her throat. She'd eaten the bread, but she hadn't had water since the bus station. You can survive 3 weeks without food, but only 3 days without water. In this cold, with her body working overtime to stay warm, dehydration would kill her faster than she thought. She looked at the back door. It was blocked by a drift of snow that had seeped through the crack at the bottom, forming a small, icy dune inside the kitchen. Mia grabbed a dented aluminum pot from a hook on the wall. It was covered in a layer of grime that looked like grease mixed with dust. She didn't have soap. She didn't care. She wiped it out with the hem of her flannel shirt, unlocked the back door, and shoved it open just enough to squeeze her arm through. The wind bit her skin instantly. She scooped the pot full of fresh, clean snow from the drift on the porch and slammed the door shut, locking it with trembling fingers. Back in the living room, she set the pot near the fire. It took agonizingly long for the snow to melt. She watched it with hawk-like intensity, feeding the fire small scraps of paper to keep the heat up. When the snow finally turned into a cloudy, lukewarm liquid, she drank it straight from the pot. It tasted like metal and dirt, but it was the best thing she had ever tasted. She checked her watch. 9:15 p.m. The night stretched out before her like a black ocean. Mia pulled the dusty drapes off the windows. The fabric was heavy, velvet maybe, or just thick with age. She wrapped them around her shoulders like a cape. It wasn't a North Face puffer jacket, but it trapped her body heat. She curled up on the rug, staring into the flames. Sleep was dangerous. She knew that. In survival movies, people who fell asleep in the cold didn't wake up, but her eyelids felt like they were weighted with lead. Snap! Mia jolted upright, gripping her makeshift club. The sound had come from overhead. Thump, drag, thump. It sounded like footsteps, heavy ones. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. The house didn't answer, but the wind gusted outside, rattling the window frames in their sockets. "It's just the house settling," she told herself. Old houses breathe. Thermal expansion, contraction. It's science, not a horror movie, but it felt like the house was watching her, assessing her. It wasn't welcoming her. It was tolerating her, the way a wolf tolerates a flea. The fire began to dim. The broken chair leg was almost gone. Mia looked at her pile of fuel. She had a few more scraps of wood and the rest of the phone book. It wouldn't last the night. If the fire went out, the temperature in here would drop to match the outside, 5 degrees below zero. She needed more wood. Mia stood up, shedding her curtain blanket. She walked back into the kitchen. There were wooden cabinets. She could smash those. There were chairs. She grabbed one of the dining chairs. It was solid oak, heavy. She raised it over her head and smashed it against the floor. It didn't break. She groaned, frustration bubbling over into rage. "Break!" she screamed, slamming it down again. "Just break!" The chair splintered on the third hit. A leg flew off, skittering across the room and hitting the far wall near the pantry. Mia panted, her breath coming in short, angry bursts. She walked over to retrieve the piece of wood. As she bent down, her flashlight, the cheap plastic lighter she flicked on for a second, caught something odd on the floor. The linoleum near the pantry wasn't just cracked, it was uneven. There was a rectangular outline in the floorboards, barely visible under the grime. One board sat slightly higher than the rest, warped by time or moisture. Mia frowned. She tapped it with the chair leg. Thud, thud. It sounded hollow. A draft brushed against her ankle. A distinct, cold breeze that wasn't coming from the window or the door. It was coming from below. She knelt. Ignoring the screaming protest of her bruised knees, she brushed away the layer of dirt. There was no handle, but there was a gap large enough for her fingers. Panic told her to ignore it. Don't open scary doors in haunted houses. But survival instinct screamed louder. Hollow means space. Space might mean storage. Storage might mean supplies, Mia jammed her fingers into the gap. The wood was rough and splintery. She pulled. It didn't budge. Come on, she gritted her teeth. She wedged the end of the broken chair leg into the crack, using it as a lever. She leaned her entire body weight onto it. Crack! The rusted hinges groaned. A high-pitched shriek of metal on metal that made her skin crawl. The trapdoor lifted a few inches, heavy and reluctant. A blast of air hit her face. It smelled distinct. Not like the dry dust of the house upstairs. This air smelled of damp earth, stone, and something else, something ancient, like old paper and dried herbs. Mia pushed the trapdoor until it flopped open, resting against the wall with a dull thud. She grabbed her lighter and held it over the abyss. The tiny flame barely penetrated the gloom. She saw steps. Steep, narrow wooden steps, descending into the belly of the earth. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. This wasn't a root cellar for potatoes. It was too deep, too hidden. Mia looked back at the living room. The fire was dying again, casting the room into semi-darkness. She had enough wood from the chair for maybe an hour. She looked down into the dark hole. If she stayed up here, she would freeze when the wood ran out. Down there, the earth might be insulated. Down there, maybe, just maybe, her parents had left something more than a rotting house. Mia tightened her grip on the lighter. She took a breath that tasted of fear and dust. Okay, Mia, she whispered to the darkness. Let's see what you're hiding. She put her foot on the first step. It creaked, but it held. She began to descend. The stairs screamed. Every wooden tread Mia stepped on let out a high-pitched whine, echoing in the tight stone throat of the stairwell. She descended slowly, one hand bracing against the rough-hewn wall, the other holding the dying Bic lighter like a holy relic. The air changed instantly. The sharp, biting freeze of the kitchen was replaced by a damp, heavy chill. It wasn't warmer exactly, but it was still. It smelled of wet earth, limestone, and something faintly metallic, like old pennies and dried blood. 10 steps, 12 steps, 15. Her Converse hit a dirt floor. Mia held the lighter up. The tiny flame danced frantically in the draft, illuminating a space that shouldn't exist. This wasn't a root cellar. Root cellars were for potatoes and onions, small holes dug to keep the frost out. This was a room. It was roughly 10 feet by 10 feet, encased in stone blocks that looked older than the house itself. In the corner sat a metal cot with a mattress that had long since surrendered to rot and mice. Beside it, a heavy oak desk sat covered in a thick gray blanket of dust. Okay, Mia whispered, her breath hung in the air, a ghost of her own making. Okay, supplies. Please be supplies. She moved toward the desk, her stomach cramping violently. She was praying for a can of peaches, a jar of pickles, a forgotten wool blanket, anything to stop the shivering that was rattling her teeth. She pulled the drawers open. Empty. She checked the space under the cot. Empty. She scanned the wooden shelves built into the stone wall. Empty. Despair hit her harder than the cold. It was a physical blow to the chest. You have got to be kidding me, she choked out, her voice cracking. This is it? This is the inheritance? She kicked the leg of the heavy desk. Thanks, Mom. Thanks for the dirt hole. The anger was hot, sudden, and useless. She slumped against the desk, the adrenaline draining out of her, leaving her hollow. The lighter grew too hot to hold. She let go of the button, and the darkness rushed back in, absolute and suffocating. Click, flick, she relit it. The flame was smaller now, sputtering. It had maybe 2 minutes of life left. If the light died down here in this stone tomb, she wasn't sure she'd ever find the stairs again. She turned to leave, to go back up to the freezing kitchen and wait for the hypothermia to take her. But as the flame flickered, it caught a glint of something on the far side of the desk, pushed all the way against the stone wall. It looked like a rock. No, too square. Mia leaned in, shielding the flame with her trembling hand. It was a box, a metal strong box, the kind you see in old Western movies, rusted shut and covered in grime. It wasn't food, it wasn't a blanket, but it was something. Mia grabbed the handle. It was heavy, surprisingly heavy. Money, she whispered, a desperate hope igniting in her chest. Please, let it be money. If there was cash, she could walk back to town in the morning. She could buy a bus ticket. She could buy a hot meal. She could get the hell out of this nightmare. She dragged the box across the desk. The metal screeched against the wood. There was a padlock on the front, but the shackle was eaten away by rust. Mia looked around for a tool. She saw a loose stone on the floor near the wall. She grabbed it, raised it high, and brought it down on the lock. Clang. The sound was deafening in the small space. The rust held. Clang. She hit it again, grunting with effort. Her hunger, her fear, her anger, she channeled it all into the stone. Clang. The lock snapped. Mia dropped the rock. She wiped her sweaty, freezing palms on her jeans. She took a deep breath, hooked her fingers under the heavy lid, and heaved it open. The hinges groaned, protesting the movement after decades of silence. Mia leaned over, bringing the dying lighter close. Her heart stopped. It wasn't money. There were no stacks of green bills, no gold coins, no jewelry. It was paper, just stacks and stacks of yellowing paper bound with twine and photos. Dozens of black and white photographs scattered loose on top like fallen leaves. No, Mia moaned, the sound escaping her lips like a sob. No, no, no. She reached in and grabbed a handful of the photos, ready to throw them across the room in frustration. What good were pictures? You couldn't eat pictures. You couldn't burn them for enough heat to save a life. But as she raised her hand, the light caught the image on the top photograph. Mia froze. It was a picture of the farmhouse. But it looked different. The roof was straight. The windows were intact. Smoke was billowing from the chimney, and in the foreground, standing knee-deep in snow, was a man. He was thin, wiry, with eyes that looked like burning coals. He was holding a shovel in one hand and reaching out with the other, not to the camera, but to someone just out of the frame. Mia flipped the photo over. On the back, written in faded fountain pen ink, was a date. December 24th, 1932, and below it a single sentence. We kept the fire. They lived. She frowned. She picked up another photo. This one showed a woman, her grandmother, she realized with a start, sitting at the kitchen table. The table was piled high with bandages. A stranger was sitting across from her, his head wrapped in white cloth, his face hidden in shadow. The inscription on the back read, "The storm took his home. We gave him ours." Mia's hand shook. The lighter burned her thumb, but she didn't drop it. She reached for the bundles of letters. The paper felt brittle, fragile as moth wings. She untied the twine on the top bundle. The first letter wasn't addressed to anyone. It was just a note, scrawled in hasty, jagged handwriting. To the one who comes next. If you are reading this, the world has turned cold again. You are looking for gold. We had none. You are looking for answers. We have only stories. But if you are a Marlo, you know that survival isn't about what you have in your pocket. It's about what you can endure. Mia stared at the words. The lighter flickered once, twice, and then died. Darkness swallowed the room instantly. But in that split second before the blackness hit, Mia didn't feel the crushing weight of the earth above her anymore. She felt the weight of the box in front of her. It wasn't trash, it wasn't just paper. She sat there in the absolute dark, clutching the photo of the man in the snow. Her stomach growled. a painful reminder of her reality. But her mind was racing. We kept the fire. Mia put the photos back in the box and closed the lid with a click. She had to get back upstairs. She had to get back to the fireplace, not just because she was cold, but because she suddenly had the strangest feeling that she wasn't the only one in this room. She was surrounded by ghosts, and for the first time in her life, they didn't feel like enemies. They felt like teachers. She stood up, feeling for the stairs in the dark. She had to get the fire going again. The climb back up the cellar stairs was a trust fall in reverse. Mia moved through the suffocating blackness, one hand sliding along the rough limestone wall, the other clutching the heavy metal box to her chest, like a shield. Her Bic lighter was dead, a useless piece of plastic in her pocket, so she navigated by the memory of the steps and the faint, dying orange glow of the embers waiting for her in the living room above. When she finally hauled herself over the lip of the trapdoor and let it slam shut, the sound echoed through the kitchen like a gunshot. She dragged the box into the living room. The fire was gasping for air, reduced to a bed of pulsing red coals. The cold had already reclaimed the corners of the room, creeping in with frosty fingers. Mia didn't panic. Panic was a luxury for people with central heating. Instead, she felt a strange, cold clarity settle over her. She grabbed the rest of the splintered oak chair and fed the wood to the embers, blowing gently until the red glow turned into a tentative yellow flame. Only when the fire was crackling again, a fragile heartbeat against the storm outside, did she turn her attention to the box. She sat cross-legged on the dusty rug, the metal strongbox between her knees. In the firelight, the rust looked like dried blood. She flipped the lid open. This time she didn't look for cash. She looked for the truth. She spread the photographs out on the rug, organizing them not by date, but by the look in the subject's eyes. There were dozens of them. One photo, sepia-toned and brittle, showed the front porch of this very house, stacked high with cords of wood. A woman in a long, tattered dress stood next to the stack, holding a double-barreled shotgun in one hand and a baby in the other. Her expression was stoic, fierce, terrifying. Mia flipped it over. Ruth Marlo, 1918, flu epidemic, kept the quarantine, kept the neighbors fed. Another photo showed a group of men sleeping on the floor of the living room, the very floor Mia was sitting on. They looked exhausted, their boots worn through, their faces gaunt. In 1932, the rails ended here, gave them soup and a dry floor. They chopped wood in exchange. Mia picked up a smaller, square Polaroid from the pile. The colors were faded, shifting into greenish hues. It was from the 90s. It showed a young couple standing in the kitchen. The man had messy hair and a flannel shirt. The woman was laughing, her hands covered in flour. Her parents. Mia's throat tightened. She'd forgotten her father's face. She was only 4 when the accident happened, and the foster system had a way of erasing memories, overwriting them with trauma and survival instincts. But here he was. He didn't look rich. He didn't look like a man who owned an estate. He looked tired, but his arm was wrapped protectively around her mother's waist. Tucked behind the Polaroid was a folded piece of notebook paper. It wasn't yellowed like the others. It was white, lined, torn from a spiral notebook. Mia unfolded it. Her hands were trembling, but not from the cold this time. Mia, if you are reading this, then the worst has happened, and we aren't there to explain. We know you're disappointed. You probably hoped for a trust fund. You hoped for a way out. But we couldn't leave you money. Every dime we made went into keeping this roof over our heads and keeping the cellar stocked for the ones who needed it. This farm isn't an asset, Mia. It's a responsibility. It's a sanctuary. For generations, the Marlos haven't been the richest family in Cedar Valley, but we have been the warmest. When the storms come, And they always come. People look for the light in our window. We didn't leave you gold because gold can be stolen. We left you a fortress. We left you the history of how to survive when the world tries to freeze you out. You have our blood. You have the fire. Don't let it go out. Love, Mom and Dad. Mia read the letter twice, then a third time. She looked up from the paper and stared into the fire. For 6 years, she had felt like a victim, a leaf blown around by the wind of the foster care system. Unwanted, unlucky, a charity case. She looked at the photo of Ruth Marlo with the shotgun. She looked at her father's protective arm. She wasn't a charity case, she was a Marlo. A shift happened in her chest, a physical sensation like a gear clicking into place. The shame she had carried for being homeless, for being poor, for having a ratted backpack and dirty hair, it evaporated. The cold draft whistled through the boarded-up window, but Mia didn't shiver. Sanctuary. She tested the word on her tongue. It wasn't just a house. It was a machine for survival. Her ancestors hadn't just lived here. They had operated this place like a lighthouse in a hurricane. Mia stood up. She felt taller. The hunger was still there, a gnawing hollowness in her stomach, but it was no longer a panic. It was just a problem to be solved. She walked to the window and peeled back the corner of the heavy drape she had used as a blanket. Outside, the world was a violent, swirling vortex of white. The blizzard had intensified. The snow was piling up against the glass, halfway up the pane. Somewhere out there, deep in the woods, a tree snapped with a sound like a cannon blast. Mia let the curtain fall back. She turned to the room. It was messy. It was freezing. It was falling apart. But it was hers. "Okay," she said aloud, her voice steady and steel hard. "You want to freeze me out? Try it." She grabbed the letter and tucked it into her back pocket. She went to the pile of furniture she had earmarked for destruction. She didn't just drag the next chair over. She picked it up and smashed it with a precise, calculated efficiency. She was feeding the fire. She was keeping the promise. But as she tossed a chair leg into the flames, a sound cut through the roar of the wind. Thump. It wasn't the house settling. It wasn't a tree branch. It was a heavy, deliberate impact against the front door. Mia froze, the firelight catching the fear dilating in her pupils. She grabbed the heaviest piece of oak she had left, a table leg with a rusted screw sticking out of the end. Thump, thump. Someone or something was outside, in a blizzard that could kill a man in minutes, and they were trying to get in. The thumping at the door wasn't polite, it was desperate. Mia stood in the center of the living room, her grip on the table leg tightening until her knuckles turned white. The wind outside was a banshee scream, rattling the bones of the old house. Thump, scratch, whine. It wasn't a person. Mia lowered the table leg an inch. A person would shout, a person would bang with a fist. This sounded low to the ground. She crept toward the entryway. The cold coming off the door was a physical wall, radiating inward. She put her hand on the knob, the metal bit into her palm like ice. "If this is a raccoon," she whispered, "I'm eating it." She turned the lock. The wind didn't wait for an invitation. It kicked the door open with a violence that nearly knocked Mia off her feet. Snow exploded into the hallway, a white blinding powder that stung her eyes. Mia squinted into the vortex. At first she saw nothing but the swirling white void. Then she looked down. There, collapsed on the welcome mat, half buried in a drift, was a heap of matted frozen fur. It wasn't a raccoon, it was a dog. A large, gray, indeterminate mix, part shepherd, part wolf, part bad luck. It wasn't moving. Mia's survival brain screamed at her, "Kick it out, slam the door, preserve the heat. You have half a piece of bread left. You can't feed a mouth that big." She reached for the door handle to pull it shut. But then the heap of fur let out a sound, a low, rattling wheeze. It was the sound of something that had fought as hard as it could and had nothing left to give. Mia froze. The image from the cellar flashed in her mind, her great-grandmother Ruth standing in the snow. "We didn't leave you gold. We left you a fortress. A fortress isn't about keeping things out. It's about who you let in." "Damn it," Mia cursed. She dropped the table leg and grabbed the dog by its scruff and hindquarters. It was heavy, dead weight, stiff with cold. She heaved, gritting her teeth. Dragging the animal across the threshold, she slammed the door shut with her shoulder and threw the bolt. The silence that returned to the house was sudden and ringing. Mia collapsed next to the animal. Up close, it was in terrible shape. Ice had formed clumps in its fur. Its ribs were visible through the coat. One ear was torn and bleeding sluggishly. "Hey," she said, shaking its shoulder. "Don't you dare die in my living room. I just cleaned up." The dog didn't open its eyes. Its breathing was shallow, irregular. Mia scrambled up. She ran to the fireplace. The fire was steady, but it wasn't enough. She needed intense heat. She threw the last of the chair legs onto the grate. Then she ran to the window, ripped down the other velvet curtain, and dragged it over to the hearth. She pulled the dog onto the rug as close to the fire as she dared. She started rubbing it vigorously with the curtain, trying to break the ice from its fur, trying to force friction and warmth back into the frozen muscles. "Come on," she panted, scrubbing the dog's flank. "Wake up." Minutes passed. Her arms burned with exertion. The dog remained limp. Mia stopped. She sat back on her heels, sweat cooling on her forehead. She looked at the creature. It was just like her. Unwanted, battered, kicked out into the storm. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the heel of the bread. It was rock hard. She looked at the bread, then at the dog. "You better be worth it," she whispered. She broke a small piece of the bread off and put it in her own mouth, chewing it into a paste. Then she pried the dog's jaws open. Its tongue was cold. She smeared the softened bread on its gums. "Eat," she commanded. "That's Wonder Bread. It's full of preservatives. It'll make you live forever." She dipped her fingers in the pot of melted snow water and dripped it into the dog's mouth. Nothing happened for a long time. The fire crackled. The wind howled. Mia curled up next to the dog, wrapping the velvet curtain around both of them, sharing her own body heat. She pressed her back against its spine, willing her own warmth to seep into it. She closed her eyes, exhaustion pulling her under. She woke up to a sound. Thump, thump, thump. It was a rhythmic, steady sound against the floorboards. Mia shot up, grabbing for her table leg. But the room was empty of intruders. The fire had burned down to embers again. She looked down. The dog was looking at her. Its eyes were amber, intelligent, and very much alive. The thumping sound was its tail, beating weakly against the floor. Mia let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for 6 years. "You're alive," she said, her voice raspy. The dog let out a soft woof and nudged her hand with a wet nose. Mia laughed. It was a rusty, unused sound, but it was real. She scratched the dog behind its good ear. "You look like a pile of fireplace leftovers," she told him. "I'm calling you Ash." Ash licked her hand. Mia stood up and walked to the window. She pulled back the corner of the curtain. The blizzard had stopped. The sun was rising over Cedar Valley. It wasn't the weak, gray light of the city. It was a brilliant, blinding gold that set the snow-covered mountains on fire. The world outside was buried under 3 feet of white powder, pristine and silent. Mia looked out at the property. For the first time, she didn't see a prison or a graveyard. She saw the barn, leaning but standing. She saw the fence line, buried but present. She saw the smoke rising from her own chimney, a signal flag against the blue sky. She turned back to the room. It was still a wreck. She was still broke. She was still a 16-year-old runaway with the authorities probably looking for her. But she wasn't alone. Ash struggled to his feet, his claws clicking on the wood. He limped over to her and leaned his weight against her leg. Mia rested her hand on his head. She touched the pocket where her mother's letter lay. "Okay, Ash," she said, looking at the sunrise. "We survived the night. Now let's see if we can survive the winter." She walked to the front door and threw it open. The cold air rushed in, but this time it didn't feel like an attack. It felt like a wake-up call. Mia stepped onto the porch, the heir to the Marlo sanctuary, and took her first breath of a new life. It was time to get to work. The sun didn't just rise over Cedar Valley, it exploded. Light flooded the farmhouse kitchen, turning the cracked linoleum into a mosaic of gold and dust. Mia sat on the floor, wrapped in her velvet curtain, a mug of hot snow water in her hands. Beside her, Ash was snoring softly, his battered gray flank rising and falling in a rhythm that felt like the house's own heartbeat. The storm had broken. The silence of the previous night, that heavy, predatory silence, was gone. In its place was the drip, drip, drip of melting icicles and the distant, cheerful caw of a crow. Mia stood up. Her muscles ached from the cold and the tension, a dull throb that reminded her she was alive. She walked to the window. The terrifying white void of the night before was now a sparkling expanse of diamonds. The carcass of a house she had seen yesterday now looked different. It looked tired, yes. It looked bruised. But it was standing. It had held the line, and so had she. "Come on, Ash," Mia said, nudging the dog with her toe. "We've got work to do." The dog groaned, stretched, and scrambled to his feet, following her as she pushed open the back door. The air was crisp enough to snap wood, but the sun was warm on Mia's face. She crunched through the snow toward the barn she'd glimpsed earlier. The structure was leaning precariously to the left, but the doors were solid. Mia heaved the barn door open. Shafts of light pierced the gloom, revealing a chaotic treasure trove of forgotten farm life. Rusted scythes, stacks of ancient lumber, and jars of nails that had fused together with age. But leaning against a workbench covered in a thick gray blanket of cobwebs was a slab of wood. Mia wiped it clean with her sleeve. It was a sign, hand-painted decades ago in bold black letters. The paint was chipped, but the message was legible. "Marlo Farm, the fire is always burning." Mia ran her fingers over the rough wood. This wasn't just a sign. It was a flag. It was the answer to every social worker who had told her she was a flight risk, to every foster parent who had looked at her like a paycheck, to the world that had tried to freeze her out. She dragged the heavy sign out into the snow. Ash barked, dancing around her, his tail wagging for the first time. Mia found a hammer and a handful of nails in the barn. She marched to the front of the property, right where the driveway met the unplowed county road. There was an old fence post there, leaning but sturdy. Thwack, thwack, thwack. The sound of the hammer echoed through the valley. It was the sound of ownership. With every strike, Mia drove a stake into her future. She hung the sign. It was slightly crooked, but it was perfect. As she stepped back to admire her work, a sound cut through the morning air. An engine. A battered red Ford pickup truck was rumbling slowly down the road, pushing a snow plow. The driver, an older man in a Carhartt jacket and a trucker hat, slowed down as he approached the driveway. He stopped the truck. He rolled down the window. Mia stiffened. She gripped the hammer. Was he going to tell her she was trespassing? Was he going to call the cops? The man looked at the sign. Then he looked at the smoke curling from the chimney of the farmhouse. Finally, he looked at the scrawny 16-year-old girl, standing in a denim jacket 2 sizes too big, guarding a 3-legged dog. He didn't yell, he didn't ask for a permit. He just tipped the brim of his hat. "Good to see smoke in that chimney again," he called out. His voice was gravelly but kind. "Rough night to move in, kid." "I made it," Mia said. Her voice was strong. "That you did," the man nodded. "I'm down the road if you need a generator. Name's Earl." He put the truck in gear and rumbled away, leaving a clear path in the snow. Mia watched him go. A lump formed in her throat, but she swallowed it down. She wasn't invisible anymore. She was a neighbor. She turned back to the house. It would take months to fix the roof. It would take years to restore the fields. She had $4, a half-eaten loaf of bread, and a dog that needed a vet. But she also had a cellar full of history. She had a fortress that knew how to breathe. And most importantly, she had the fire. Mia looked at Ash. "Let's go inside. I think there's some potatoes in the root cellar we missed." She walked back up the drive, her boots leaving deep, permanent footprints in the snow. She wasn't running away anymore. For the first time in her life, Mia Marlo was running towards something. She was home. End of narrative. Some inheritances aren't measured in bank accounts or property deeds. Some are measured in grit, in memory, and in the stubborn refusal to let the cold win. Maya didn't just inherit a farmhouse. She inherited a responsibility to keep the door open for the next person who gets lost in the storm. We all have storms, and we all have a choice. Do we let the fire go out, or do we pile on the wood and wait for the morning? What about you? If you found a key to a hidden history in your family, would you have the courage to walk down those stairs? Or would you have run back to the city? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. If this story warmed you up, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We have so many more stories of survival, secrets, and second chances coming your way. Don't let your fire go out. See you in the next video.